Chapter 13, Section 2. Now, Congress was going to be at odds with Johnson, Andrew Johnson, that is. You see, Congress was Republican. Andrew Johnson wasn't. He was Democrat. But the problem that the Republicans were going to have is they couldn't agree amongst themselves. You see, the Republicans are going to be split into two main groups. On one hand, you have the moderates. The moderate Republicans, they very simply wanted to bring the states back into the Union. No super big changes. Let's just restore them. Now, we're going to keep the Confederates out of the government. And we will give the African Americans some civil equality. But we're not talking about the right to vote. Some very moderate changes. On the other hand, the opposite of the moderate Republicans were going to be the radical Republicans. The radical Republicans wanted some radical changes, some big changes. They thought that African Americans should be able to vote. They wanted to create a new South. A new South that had all men with equal rights. Now, some, especially radical Republicans, said land reform was the key to everything. Land reform. If we could give the African Americans land, that's going to help them build a life. An example of a radical Republican that was a big pusher for land reform was Thaddeus Stevens. Thaddeus Stevens, he wanted to take these large southern plantations and he wanted to divide them up. They're huge. Divide them up and give these former slaves a piece of land from these southern plantations. If they could get that land, economic independence would be the key. They could provide for themselves, they'll eventually get political power. Thing was, this never really caught on. It wasn't that popular. People didn't want to go and take away people's land. They thought it was going to cause more issues. In actuality, there were very few Northerners that wanted African Americans to have suffrage or the right to vote. Let's talk for a minute about this gentleman right here, Frederick Douglass. Quick background on Frederick Douglass. He was born in 1817 as a slave. During his entire life, he only saw his mother 4 or 5 times. By the time he is 6 years old, he's already working. In 1825, he's going to be sent to Baltimore, Maryland, where he is going to be taught to read and write. By the time he's 15, he's moved again. By the time he's 15, he is dreaming about escape. In 1838, he escapes. He's going to become a huge leader in the anti-slavery cause. And now during the time period of Reconstruction, he's going to become a huge radical Republican supporter, even meeting with Lincoln at times. Now, this moderate versus radical Republican split isn't going to last real long. In 1866, the Civil War's been over for a year. Congress wants to hold hearings about the South. They want to know how are things going. And what they hear is reports of violence. They hear reports of churches being burned, schools being burned, people's homes being burned. People that supported the Union in the South, they were getting death threats. Congress also is going to hear about the Freedmen Bureau and have decisions to make about the Freedmen Bureau. The Freedmen Bureau was something that was created by Congress for 1 year. It was going to help out Southerners after the war, help give them food, clothing, help them find jobs, set up hospitals, set up schools. They also would help settle contract disputes. Because as these former slaves were now wage workers, they had contracts with the landowners down there. And there would not always be the best contracts. And one of the criticisms of the Freedmen's Bureau was a lot of times it would help encourage these former slaves to accept the contract. And a lot of people don't like that. Well, here we are. You have the Freedmen's Bureau made to help out the Southerners after the war. And Congress has to decide, do we extend it or don't we extend it? Now, Andrew Johnson, the president, he is not a fan of the Freedmen's Bureau. He's going to get 2 generals. He's going to send them to the South, send them on a tour, and basically say, hey, find out what you can about the Freedmen's Bureau. Because Johnson's convinced that they're going to go down south, they're going to talk to people, and people won't like the Freedmen's Bureau. They're going to find all sorts of complaints. But what these 2 generals, they come back, they report to Congress, and what they report was people liked it. It was working. It was helping people out. And the overall consensus was this was a good thing. So Congress is going to vote to extend it. 1 year wasn't enough. Let's keep this thing going. When Congress votes to extend the Freedmen's Bureau, it goes to the president's desk, where Johnson is going to veto extending it. Johnson says, the U.S. should not feed, clothe, educate, and shelter freedmen. Now, Congress is furious. They just heard great things about it. They extended it. And then Johnson says, no. That brings us now to the Civil Rights Act of 1866. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 is actually going to be the first civil rights law in our nation's history. And it says that everyone born in the U.S. is a citizen with full civil rights. It does not guarantee voting rights, though. It was only designed to overturn some of these old discriminatory laws, some of these old Supreme Court decisions that said African Americans could never be a citizen. Congress passes the Civil Rights Act, 1866. It goes to Johnson's desk, where he vetoes it. Congress is furious. Johnson has no more support in Congress now. It didn't matter if you were a moderate or a radical. You were now united against Johnson. Just because the president vetoes a bill does not mean it necessarily goes away. It goes back to Congress, where Congress can vote to override a veto. And Congress is going to override both of Johnson's vetoes. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 is passed. The Freedmen's Bureau is extended. Now, the Republicans Congress were a little bit scared in the fact they're like, you know what, here in a few years there could be an election, they could elect whole new people to Congress, they could be Democrats, and they're just going to undo all this. So Congress, controlled by Republicans, decided to pass something that's a little harder to overturn. Congress passes the 14th Amendment. In 1866, it's going to be officially approved in 1868. But the 14th Amendment is going to grant equal citizenship to African Americans. You cannot deprive somebody their life, liberty, or property without due process of the law. But again, this does not guarantee voting rights. But in this amendment, it does have a small part that does address voting. And it says, if you are a state that does not let African Americans vote, you will have less representatives in Congress. So there was a punishment put in place saying, hey, you don't have to let them vote, but you will not have as many representatives in Congress.